term that gets thrown around quite a lot in the commercial and particularly in the investor space is things like cap rates and yields. Did you want to touch base on sort of what those mean for those sort of first-time investors who might not understand sort of that jargon that gets thrown around?
Yeah, so look, the cap rate will just simply be what you've purchased it for by the net income that's come through, right? And that's just like the time of that transaction. And obviously there's the life of the lease and there's the life of the property. And those all things do need to be considered, and they get considered by your lenders as well. And they get considered like, will the lease expire, during your loan agreement, all of those types of things. And that will have an effect on the rate that you get. But I think each industry, by industry I mean industrial, office, retail, will have a different level of cap rate. There isn't really a generic cap rate that you could just say, hey, you should buy office at 6%, you should buy retail at 5.5% and industrial at 5%. Yeah. It's very loose for that to be the case. Each property really does need to be analysed and spoken to, and that brings me back to my point of getting the right team around you from the very beginning. Is really helpful when analysing these assets.
And then sort of further to that, you sort of touched on the difference between a gross yield and a net yield.
So when looking on the tin, you might see an agent say, oh, this sold for a 5.5% yield, right? But the disclosure really not necessarily there. Was it a net return? Was it a gross return? Was it a retail lease? Because if it was a retail lease, then land taxes are taken into the equation of outgoings, and that's a further deduction because the retail tenant can't legally pay land tax. So there's all the additional deductions that you might just, by looking at the surface, think that's what you should be going for. But when you get your actual income statement at the end, you're like, wait a second, it is a lot less. The difference between it is that the gross yield is including the outgoings that would be represented on owning the asset. Typically, a retail asset will be a gross lease, and office leases are definitely going down the path of gross leases as well, although there are still some and still being done today that are net, which just means that the structure of the lease is that the tenant will pay the net rent plus the outgoings. But this is why you've got to break down every lease when you're looking at an investment property, because it is only as good as the lease. So if the lease doesn't cover off that the tenant pays for property management fees, doesn't pay for your annual auditing fees, doesn't pay for your management of repairs and maintenance within your building, so your aircon and repairs, everything like that, all of that will eat out of your net return. So those two get tossed around mainly around the structure of the lease.